Alright, so in this video, we're going to focus on the single heat output burner with the solid tips. This one I got from Walnut Hollow. It doesn't have an adjustable heat temperature setting on it, it's just got the on-off switch. These are some of the tips that I've gotten for mine. I don't use them all, I don't really like most of them. I tend to just use the teardrop tip. So it's just a blunt round tip. And then we've got a chisel tip. It's just a small chisel tip. We've got a larger chisel tip and it's on a bit of an angle there. It might also be called a calligraphy tip. We've got these pointy ones. They're really great for detailing, although I find they're a little bit too harsh on the ends, like too sharp. They're almost flat, they're not really round or anything. So I actually use a piece of sandpaper and I sanded mine down to a rounder point. It makes it a lot easier to work with. And then my favorite one is this teardrop looking one. I don't know the actual name for it, unfortunately. A couple good things to have on hand when you're using these burners is a stand to put it on. And I've got just this brass wire brush. It's great for cleaning the tips. And you also want a pair of pliers because if you're changing the tip partway through, they're gonna be really hot. These tips take a little bit to cool down, so you wanna make sure you're using proper safety. All right, so I've got my burner all heated up and it's sitting on the stand so I don't burn myself. I've got my practice board here and I've got this chart drawn up and I will show each of the tips what they can do, and then I've got another area how you can apply that to your designs. So each area I've got the different tips listed. So stippling, the blunt tip for lines, blunt tip shading, chisel tip lines, chisel tip shading, chisel tip detail, pointed tip lines, pointed tip detail, pointed tip shading, the teardrop lines, teardrop detail, teardrop shading. So with my pen here, I'm just gonna give it a quick clean on my brush, just to make sure all the carbon buildup is off. I really like this tip for stippling. You can get small stipples with it, but you can also get big ones. They're not very deep. So I'm just gonna move this down so I can show you. So you can do small stippling with it. You can also do larger ones by leaving it on just a little bit longer, or you can go straight down. It'll give you more of a perfect circle. You can also just do quick. And get little ones. This is very good for giving some really nice texture to backgrounds if you've got a lot of black in them and stuff and you just want to give that extra texture. All right, so over here we've got lines that you can achieve with this. Because this is a wider point, you will get thicker lines. So if you go slow, you're gonna get those darker lines. All right, so we can incorporate these. I just left this one blank just because I mainly use the stippling for larger areas to fill in, but you can also use it for dot work. So I'm gonna do an outline here of a not so perfect circle, and I'm just gonna stipple the whole thing in. All right, so I've got that area. I know it's kind of hard to see, but that whole area is stippled. You can also do it if you want to stipple a gradient. When you do a gradient with stippling, the denser they are, like the closer they are together, the darker the area. And then as you slowly move them apart, the lighter the area. You can also make them smaller as you move further away for the lighter areas. I find this one is very bulky to use for outlining. All right, so let's move on to the next one here. So with the blunt tip, you can do shading, but because it's a single heat, it's harder to achieve the nice smooth shading, especially with this tip, because there's no really flat surface on it. You can shade dark with it, and when you shade, I always find going in circles will work best. All right, so there we have the dark. Now, if you want to do a gradient, the slower you move, the darker it's going to burn. So if you start moving faster, you don't want to move side to side, because when you move side to side, you're going to get these dots. But if you move in circles, you don't get those. So this is where it can be time consuming and layering is needed. You're not going to get that smooth burn because it's that high heat, but you can get a nice texture from it. There. So that's just using the circles. You can see some of the circles, which is, to me, that's okay. Everybody's got their own style, but I like that it gives it a little bit of a texture. It doesn't look so flat. All right, so while I still got this tip in before moving on to the chisel tip, I'm gonna go ahead and show you shading on these. With this one, again, it's because it's such a large tip, it's really hard to get like a detailed type shading, and the lighter touch you have as well will also help. See, this tip is just, it's bulky. I personally do not like this tip. It's very hard to get a good shade with it in small areas. All right, so I'm gonna swap out my tip now and put the chisel tip in. This is the small chisel tip. I'm not gonna show the large chisel tip because they're basically the same. One's just on an angle. So when I swap this out, I wanna make sure I'm using my pliers, and then I've got a spare piece of wood to drop the tip onto because it will burn and you don't want to burn your work. Okay, so now my tip has heated up. Again, this is the small chisel tip. It's great for doing lines because it's got that hard tip, like it's in a point. So with the chisel tip, the more of an angle you hold it at, the more feathering around the edge there's going to be. And of course it's going to be wider as well. So you can use it for outlining and stuff. It is kind of hard to get curves, as I will show you on this side. This curve's not too bad. So as you can see, my lines are not turning out great here. So it's really good for straight lines, not great for anything curved. And that's okay. Everybody will have a different way they want to do stuff. Some of these tips are going to work better for some of you, and some of you are not going to like some of them at all. And that's okay. Everybody's got their personal preference. All right, so we're going to move on to the shading for the chisel tip. Like I showed previously up here, the lower of an angle you put it on, the more of the flat surface you're going to get. And that's kind of going to be the best for shading. Again, because it's just a single heat output burner, it is not the greatest for getting that smooth shading. You'll get a little bit of the texture, of course, and you're not going to get the really light shading. So again, like up here with the blunt tip, you don't want to go back and forth, because going back and forth just causes heat points, like the really hot points, the dark ones. But going in circles won't create those. So this, if you're trying to get straight black, you can pull it. I personally don't like this because I don't like the lines, the look of the lines. I prefer the circling. And the lighter pressure you put and the faster you go, the lighter the burn's going to be. You may have to work it a little bit more and go over it a few times to get a full shade instead of just circles. All right, so there's a little bit of a gradient with the chisel tip. It is hard to achieve. Again, it's not my personal favorite, but everybody's got their own style and their own technique, and who knows, it may be a great one for you. Chisel tip detail. So because the corners of these are really sharp, you can get small detail with them. So I will do just some lines with just the corners. And this is where the other chisel tip might come in handy, this one here, because then you've got more of the point. And this one here, the softer you go, of course, the lighter it's going to be. All right, so moving on over here, I've got a couple little pictures drawn up. I've got an antler here. I can show you some of the detail that you can do with the chisel tip and like just overlapping lines. So you can see some of the shading. It's not going to be great because again, it's kind of a small area. You need a larger area to kind of get the shading a little bit better with this. All right, so there's some of the shading. Again, you're gonna have texture to it. It's not gonna be that nice, soft, smooth shading. All right, over here we got the antler, and for this, I'm just gonna use the very point on the edge here for this. And I'm gonna start light. So for some of this detail here, I am just doing, again on the point, I'm just doing some small circles, quickly, lightly, and giving it just a little bit of shading. It's not much. And again, this is just to play around with, so these do not have to be perfect. All right, so I've got kind of like a base texture down. And then to do with the detail, you can do some lines. All right, I just wanted to bring it in closer so you can see some of the detail, especially with the other tips I'm going to be doing. You're going to want to see more of the detail up close, whereas these ones were bigger tips, so you didn't need to be that close. So again, here is using just the very tip on the chisel tip. I'm just lightly using the tip. And then I'm just lightly darkening the sides here with just the tip. Almost like outlining it. Outlining things with the chisel turned on the point like this makes it a lot easier than you can see doing it up here, especially for curved areas. And if you do it light enough, then you can always go over it to darken it. Just like that. I'm going to use this one here, the pointed tip. So it's got a very flat, hard tip. And then I just sanded this one down. You can kind of see a little bit of the curve there. I just use sandpaper. These tips are pretty good for being able to use a little bit of sandpaper on. And then you can sand any of the tips to make a shape you want. All right, so I've got my pointed tip in and it's all heated up. So this section here is going to be lines. So this tip is really good for outlining, especially if you can get a little bit of sandpaper and just give it a little bit of a curve on the top, and then it won't be so harsh. I find the other one can scratch and gouge. If I press harder and go slower, I'm going to get that deeper, wider line. Another one, I don't have a spot for it, but another one you can do with this is you can do small stippling with this one. And also with the detail, it's similar to that. The lighter you touch it down, the softer it's going to be. And then you can go over the lines to darken them up if you need to. I have a couple little sticks and a flower. So I'm not going to do the full thing because this is just to quickly show you. So this is actually a tree trunk. This is a really great tip for small details, line work, but I'm not gonna get into that one. All right, here we have a flower. You can do the outline. You can get some really nice feathery lines, so it's really good for doing fur as well. And it would look a lot better with some shading too. But that gives you an idea of some of the nice detail work that you can achieve using the pointed tip. So over here, we have the pointed tip shading. So to shade with this tip, just because it's so small, it is time consuming. So again, you don't want to go back and forth because you're going to get those dots, right? And they don't look the nicest. Always try and go in the circles. The lighter the pressure and the faster you go, the lighter it's going to be. I'll start up here where it will be dark. And then we can slowly work our way out. I always try and do a base layer for my shading. So I can always go back and darken it. I can't go back and lighten it. Again, just take your time. You don't want to push hard. You'll end up gouging the wood and burning it, and you don't want that. All right, so there's a little bit, you can see the texture of the swirls, which again, personally, I really like. It gives it almost like an antique kind of coppery look to it. All right, so this is for the teardrop, so I'm just gonna move on over to here. So the teardrop will do the lines. So we're just gonna do a little bit of the shading. Let's go in between and shade a little bit in between. I'm gonna start down here with the lighter. And again, because it's the single heat burner, the smaller the area, the harder it's gonna get to keep that shading under control. So again, like the little areas here, they're gonna be harder to shade with the single heat unit. You can try blowing on the tip to cool it off a little bit before putting your pen back down, and that might help. I think this might be too small of an area to try and shade, so that one didn't quite work out. All right, so that one didn't work out, and that's okay. All right, moving on to our last tip here. I have this one all heated up. This is the teardrop tip. It's kind of an awkward tip. It took me quite a while to get used to it, but then it turned into my favorite tip, and I quite enjoy using it. I also use sandpaper on this one to adjust it. The butt of the tip, or the heel of it, wasn't very flat when I got it. So I just used some sandpaper and sanded it down so it was nice and flat. There's still a little dent into it, but I don't burn that far back on the heel. I burn more right across here. I use the tip quite a bit. And again, the tip on this one was a little more on the sharp side, so I have used my sandpaper to give it a nice soft edge. So again, because of the angle that this one's at, it feels funny. So it takes a little bit more getting used to. I have to hold my hand more upright. So these lines are a little bit softer than the other ones that we've done. But it's still, once you get used to this tip, it is fairly easy to control the tip. You can also turn it around. I've done this for small detailed areas and use the tip. Nice, so I'm gonna move over here and I'm gonna outline some of these. If you also need your wrist up more, you can put another piece of wood underneath to prop your hand up. All right, so there's some of the lines. All right, now we're gonna move over here to the teardrop detail. So you can just use, again, the tip like you did with the lines for getting detail. And again, the faster you move, the lighter pressure you put, you can get lighter lines. I think this is the one pen where you can actually get the nicer, softer lines. You can also flip this over and use just the point for small detail. And the shading. So again, I'm using just the tip on this. Prop my wrist up on another piece of wood just to give me that better angle. And again, like all the other times, don't go back and forth because you get those, I don't know what they're called, heat points. Go in circles. And with this pen, you can get a nice shade. Nicer than this. And it's still gonna have the texture. Again, you're not gonna get that really feathered shade. And because the tip is so small, it's going to be more time consuming than using a bigger tip, but that is okay. Just go back and keep working it over, keep with light pressure going faster. The faster you go, the more lighter it's going to be. Again with those circles. All right, another part that you can use the heel of the burner or the whole flat part. You can get more of a smoother burn with it, but it will cover more area. It's not good for smaller areas. So if you got like a larger background to do or something, this is good. It's a little bit harder to control. The slower you go, the darker it's going to be. So again, it's really good for backgrounds and stuff, smoke even, if you're doing anything with smoke, clouds, because then it's got a little bit of the texture, but it's a little bit more difficult to control. All right, so we've done the detail and the shading. So I've got a little bit of a puffy cloud, one of the clouds I like to do here. So I'm just outlining that. I'm gonna do a little bit of shading here. And you can find different angles to work this at. It's not just the tip. You can hold it just a little bit lower, more at an angle. Again, it's what's gonna work best for you. You just gotta try it and give it more than once. All right, so there's a little bit of shading. Again, it's got the texture. I didn't use this shading in it, I just didn't have the room. So that's why I showed you down here. And like if you flip it over, just some little details. All right, there we go. So that was 4 different tips that I showed you, different textures, lines, shading, and whatnot with them. That's with the single heat output solid tip burner. I do highly recommend, if you're going to get one, if you don't have one already, get one that's got the adjustable temperature. It'll save you so much work. It's a lot harder this way, as you can see. This was difficult, especially trying to do some like line work in that. It's a lot harder to control when you don't have a temperature that you can adjust. So definitely having that is well worth it. But these are great little burners. I do like the high heat on them for getting really black areas. It works quite well for that. But otherwise, it's a good tool to start with.